The history of giving all adult citizens in the United States the right to vote surfaces some quite bizarre paradoxes worthy of our consideration. I'm Tom Army, and welcome to this Suffrage edition of United States History Online. No one can deny the debate over whether to give women the right to vote after the Civil War proved contentious. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and other passionate women fiercely opposed the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which enfranchised African American men. To enfranchise means to bestow the rights of citizenship that primarily seem to mean the right to vote. Stanton, Anthony, and others opposed the 15th Amendment because it glaringly omitted women's right to the privilege to cast a vote. In fact, during a heated meeting in New York City's Steinway Hall in 1869, Stanton directed her ire towards the famous black abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Douglass, of course, had defended the 15th Amendment on the grounds that while women deserve equal suffrage, in the aftermath of the Civil War, the nation must act more urgently to give black men the right to vote. Douglass said, "If we, meaning black males, know enough to shoulder a musket and fight for the flag of the government, we know enough to vote. What I ask for the Negro is not benevolence, not pity, not sympathy, but simple justice." But the 15th Amendment also drove a wedge between women's suffrage organizations. Stanton and Anthony's National Women's Suffrage Association broke with Lucy Stone's American Women's Suffrage Association, which supported the 15th Amendment. Lucy Stone elected to work for incremental change for women, and she saw the 15th Amendment as a step in that direction. Stone recognized that most men and many women still remained outspoken critics of women's suffrage. Now, during this period, a small number of women elected to challenge voting rights laws that banned women from the polls via the court system. On October 15, 1872, Virginia Minor, an apostle of the National Women's Suffrage Association, walked into a St. Louis courthouse to register to vote. Minor's actions, part of a nationwide pattern of civil disobedience, directly confronted the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Similarly, Susan B. Anthony had led a small delegation of women in upstate New York to register. And in fact, they voted in the 1872 presidential election. And by the way, they voted for General Grant. 3 weeks after the election, the courts charged Anthony with voter fraud and fined her $100. A fine she never paid. Mrs. Minor, however, she met a quite different fate. The clerk for St. Louis County, Minor-Happersett, simply refused to register her to vote. Minor repeatedly challenged the clerk's refusal in the lower courts, losing each time, and eventually appealed the decision to the U.S. Supreme Court, which agreed to hear her case. Now, Minor argued that as a citizen of the United States, she held a right to vote because of the Privileges and Immunity Clause under the 14th Amendment, and because the first sentence of the 15th Amendment read, quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States," end quote. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Morrison Waite, wrote the court's unanimous decision, which held that although the court recognized the citizenship of Virginia Minor, the 14th Amendment granted only former slaves equality and did not grant expanded rights to the general population. He said the amendment did not add the right to vote to the general privileges of citizenship. Consequently, the Supreme Court upheld the state court in Missouri, which had refused to register a woman as a lawful voter because the state's laws allowed only men to vote. Now, the court emphasized 3 points. First, when the Constitution was adopted, none of the 13 states gave all citizens the right to vote. Those states restricted suffrage based on sex, race, age, and ownership of land. Second, the government did not exclude any state from rejoining the Union during Reconstruction for lack of women's voting rights. And third, the 15th Amendment made sure voting rights were not denied on account of race or color. In other words, the amendment was not necessary if citizenship alone conferred voting rights. Chief Justice Waite wrote that, quote, "It cannot for a moment be doubted that if it had been intended to make all citizens of the United States voters, the framers of the Constitution would not have left it to implication. So important a change in the condition of citizenship as it actually existed, if intended, would have been expressly declared," end quote. In the Minor-Happersett decision, the case brought by Virginia Minor, the Supreme Court saw itself as upholding states' rights that appeared to have waned during the Civil War. The court wished to stop any further extension of federal power that might undermine the traditional role of the states to protect their citizens' best interests. In the late 19th century, individual human rights appeared less endangered than the rights of states, or so the court argued. Eventually, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution overturned Minor-Happersett. Interestingly, courts later cited this defunct decision when supporting restrictive voting laws that targeted blacks, laws that put in place poll taxes and literacy tests as a requirement to vote. Consider this. In 1867, Mississippi registered 67% of African Americans to vote. 25 years later, in 1892, that number dropped to 4%. Now, finally, in the 1960s, the court began interpreting the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause as a guarantee of voting rights for all citizens in good standing. Now, how that came about is a story for another day. But finally, think of this. Does history demonstrate that courts have successfully cast a blind eye to politics and public bias.